I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my analysis into metropolitan conflict. We're on section 1.7 of my notes, which is on page 18. You can access the PDF by clicking the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Just download it, use it to supplement your reading. And with that, let's begin with section 1.7. So this is metropolitan conflict. Section 1.7. And with that, let's begin. So the city's possessive, and I drew a diagram, just a rough generalization, how we can make sense of the distribution, right? The contemporary distribution of the relationship between the city central and the suburbs. And obviously this visual representation is just a general approximation. This is how we can make sense of sprawl. So that sprawl is sort of the radius outside of the city central, that distance from the city central to the periphery of the suburbs, or actually probably the central aspect. No, it would probably be the periphery, right? The periphery of the suburbs would constitute sprawl, right? The longer that magnitude, the greater that distance, the greater the sprawl. And, well, in terms of the city central, there's residential sprawl as well. And we talked about that quite a bit. So I'm not gonna go into the image more than that by discussing what we've already discussed. The original relationship between the city central and the suburbs was one of economic dependency on the city central. This changed in the mid-1950s and 1960s. It really got emphasized in the 70s and 80s, and now economic hub, economic engine for many of the suburban communities throughout our nation is within the suburban community in and of itself, which means that the economic hub, which was otherwise it was situated in the city central, is now dilapidated, right? And thus the dilapidation of the economic hub results in a dilapidation of the city central. So we talked about that. So let's look into 4 problems within the city central. I've cited the author where I'm getting the text from, so these page numbers correspond with the citation at the right underneath section 1.7. So 4 problems with the city central. Four problems with city central. Number 1, quote, central cities are twice as poor as their suburbs. Right? So central city, and this was in, this is a bit dated. This citation comes from 1974. We'll get to contemporary discussions on this, and this has changed because poverty has now moved into the suburbs, and I'll talk about that in this lecture series as well. But just to give you sort of a holistic account, the citation is from 74, so this information is a bit dated now. At the time, it was the case that we've centralized poverty to a specific locality, so that poverty was situated, it was isolated, if not necessarily isolated, but it was more representative. There was, as the author has said, a double representation, an over-representation, twice as much representation of poverty in the central city than their suburbs, right? So initially, we can say I-N-I-T-I. Poverty was concentrated, in the central city. So we had a concentration of poverty in the central city, and all of the problems that come with that concentration abound. Obviously, this would mean increased criminality and increased incarceration rates, decreased property value, decreased tax revenue, and on and on and on and on, and all the complications that arise with poverty. It's something that we are in a contemporary setting. We're trying to make sense of how we deal with poverty now, because it's expanding as I'm talking. It's funny, and I don't want to get too far off track. I want to sort of stick to the notes, because I'll be here forever if I don't stay sort of focused. But it's funny how people are quick to talk about, theorists, not regular sort of folks, but theorists are quick to talk about the end of capitalism and the problems with capitalism, the inherency of all of this, the inherency for the need of the end of capital and such, and then you say, okay, well, let me humor my interlocutor and entertain this conversation, and let's think about it practically, right? If we're gonna talk about a state of affairs where this doesn't work, we should at least be able to address poverty initially, because the argument is from the interlocutor that capital is the cause for poverty, that poverty doesn't naturally occur. Okay, no problem. So how do we get rid of poverty? And then there's this grandiose discussion of, the eventual implosion and this grandiose global revolution. And I'm asking, the theorists and scholars of the next generation, the next generation of scholars, the next generation of theorists, the next generation of academicians and editors and journal publishers, think about the practicality of just trying to answer that question. Forget about all that other stuff that pertains to capital and blah, 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 blah. Practically, how do we resolve poverty? It is a profoundly easy question to ask. It is an exceedingly difficult thing to solve, right? It's multifaceted, multi-complex. It's seemingly infinitely many variables and contingencies and dependencies that influence poverty within any nation, especially the United States. So the idea that we can easily wave a magic wand and do away with poverty is ridiculous. And what we are finding now in the research is that poverty has changed since this publication in '74. It's moved from the city central into the suburbs, and we have to start asking ourselves, what is that going to make of our suburban communities? What does that mean for the suburbs? What does it mean for our social services and the networks in place to support our citizenry in terms of a concentration not anymore or not so much, not as prominent in the city central, but now in the suburbs? What does that mean? There are any number of problems that arise, and we should be always at the forefront of attempting to anticipate the problems and bring about resolutions as much as possible, or at least mitigate some of the growing conflict. Number two, a large percentage of central city residents can be counted among the near poor. I mean, that's sort of obvious, right? So that there is an overrepresentation of poverty among the citizenry in the central, city central. Again, dated information, right? So overrepresentation. Overrepresentation of poor citizens within the city. I think the stats on this have changed as well, as I said before, and later I'm going to talk about migration of poverty to the suburbs. I'm almost positive I discussed this. I'll see if I did. Yeah, the very last section on page 22, so if you want to jump ahead, just to check really quick, page 22, bottom of page 22, section 1.9, the migration of poverty to the suburbs. So I start by talking about the history of poverty in America, and poverty in America was historically centralized. Once we got past 1950s and 1960s in the federal investment in the infrastructure connecting the central city to the suburbs and the explosion of suburban lifestyle, this is the Leave It to Beaver era, where it became normativized, suburban living became normativized. That also brought about sprawl, congestion, traffic, such and such. But also what it did was it led to an overrepresentation for those quote-unquote left behind. Those left behind in the central city now were there because they couldn't afford to leave the central city and live in the suburbs, and thus at the time there was an overrepresentation of poverty in the city central. This, again, as we'll see when we get to section 1.9 a few hours from now, has changed as a consequence of the migration of poverty almost as anthropomorphized itself into the suburban community. And we'll talk about how that occurred and some of the consequences of that when we get to section 1.9. Number three, much of the burden of paying the cost of poverty in this central city falls on the near poor. And this is important, right? Much of the burden of paying the costs of poverty. It's a little bit ambiguous what the author is saying here, but there's two ways to interpret this sort of the costs of poverty. Right? So one way that we can interpret the cost is obviously the sort of direct way of interpreting it, which is the economic, E-C-O-N-O, right? The economic expenditure to pay for poverty. So this would be any type of welfare assistance program, any of our social services programs, any mental health counseling, child protective services, you name it, anything pertaining to the appropriation of federal tax monies as a means of assisting the poor. So there is a cost to it. The other aspect of cost, obviously, isn't a consequence of the economic expenditure needed to bolster and assist those who need the quote-unquote costs of poverty, or all of the negative consequences associated with poverty. So the second bit is obviously the negative consequences. And it would be interesting, I'm sure, this isn't my field per se, but I'm sure someone's already done this research, but it would be interesting in 2014 to look at the gradual increase of negative consequences associated with poverty, and this is what I mean specifically. As technology advances and we become more technologically advanced as a nation and as a society, globally and locally and nationally, there are consequences to an individual family's or an individual person's inability to get some of the basic needs. So, for example, you need a telephone in case of an emergency. So the idea that a phone is a luxury, while it might have been a luxury at some point in our history, it's a necessity now. So a phone, at least a home phone, is a basic need. Some may even argue a cell phone is a basic need. An inability to have a phone creates, as a consequence of poverty, creates a condition in which you can't get assistance when you need help, obviously. So you can see now sort of the quote-unquote cost of being poor. Another cost of being poor, especially for younger children, and I think this is a huge problem. I've seen many social movements to make accommodations for this, and shout out to USA for trying to take care of its poor students. But you can imagine that you're the parent of, you're impoverished, and you're probably a single parent, and you're probably a minority woman, and you have multiple kids or one or two kids, and the idea is your children need to access the internet in order to complete their assignments. They have to go online to do that, and this isn't a luxury. The internet accessibility is no longer a luxury. I don't know if people are arguing for a right to internet, right? I don't know if we've gotten that advanced where the internet now, like speech, becomes a right, but I definitely see that in our future. But the idea is there's a need. It's no longer a desire, it's no longer a want, it's no longer a luxury. There's a need for internet accessibility, especially for those who are still K through 12 education. Poverty, the costs of not being able to access, or maybe not even not being able to access, but not even being able to access a substantial enough sort of DSL provider with enough bandwidth so that you can stream videos or download content, information, or PDFs and what have you. Watch my lectures. You wouldn't think that just the ability to watch my lectures is a privilege, but the fact that you're watching my lecture right now is a privilege, right? This is sort of, it's interesting because everybody was, white privilege in respect to race. I don't think that people understand technological privilege, right? So sometimes white or black, anything, if you live in a technologically adapted society like the United States of America, and you can watch this video in 720 HD, streaming it while you've got some music in the background, which would be weird if you listen to music while I'm lecturing. But if you can do that, there's privilege associated with that, and you get the tremendous benefits of being able to access my notes, supplement your learning, and such. There needs to be that benefit, that opportunity afforded to those who don't have economic substantial enough, or even the necessary enough economic means to be able to educate themselves properly. So this cost, the second interpretation of cost, is one which inhibits potential opportunity. And poverty as such is probably the greatest inhibitor, aside from just personal, people undermine themselves, right? People shortcut themselves and undermine themselves. A lack of will is the greatest force for undermining your progress in the world, I believe. But aside from that, poverty in and of itself is such a powerful force. It's such a powerful force which suffocates and stifles and depresses one's inability, or a community's or family's ability to gain greater opportunity for themselves and their community. So it's this cost is very very important. Number 4, then, central cities have quote unquote older housing, higher crime rates, more money spent for social services, and less money for education. And again, the crippling of educational opportunity, and you recognize what that brings, right? A lack of education inherently undermines social mobility. I mean, just period. If you do not have the requisite knowledge, if you do not have the requisite training, if you do not have the requisite sort of habituated practice and habit of time management and organization and leadership, then you're not going to be qualified for the business community, or you'll be less qualified for the business community. I think what people don't recognize is that education isn't just about getting your degree in business or getting your degree in history or science and math. Education is about the discipline that's afforded the individual, the opportunity to work in groups, the opportunity to assume leadership positions, the opportunity to make decisions, really complex decisions, depending on where you are in your matriculation. But definitely at the graduate level, this is what it's all about. And those characteristics of leadership, of organization, of time management are exactly the characteristics needed for a booming private industry. Without that educational opportunity, you undermine your own ability to facilitate any function of private industry that will perpetually overlook members of the impoverished community, because they think to themselves, justifiably to some extent, there isn't a habituated, a demonstrated, proven means of me assessing sort of the work ethic and the morale, the practice, the organization, the time management, and leadership skills and abilities needed for this position, and thus the rub, right? So there is some legitimacy. I think it's very weird. Psychologists, if you're a psychology student, I think it would be very, very interesting to do research, because I hear this all the time from primarily conservatives, but I do tend to agree with this position, at least the interpretation of the position. I think the position should be changed. But the argument is something like, a prolonged period of unemployment decreases the likelihood that the potential and prospect will gain employment. So that there's an inverse relationship, right? The longer the amount of time, or the greater the amount of time spent unemployed, the less likely the individual will be employed. And the question is, why is that? It's not a question I can answer. I'm not a shrink. There's all types of psychological blah, blah, blah in that. I would be very interested in reading a survey or a study, a comprehensive, really big, huge, and why that is the case. I don't quite know why that is the case. And not only is it the case, not only is this potentially true, it might be biased, I'm sort of socially constructed, I'll grant that. But the question becomes, this happens for people who've already demonstrated mastery. They have master's degrees, and some have doctorate degrees, right? So it's not like these people haven't already gained their education. But it's so powerful staying up to date, right, with your continuing education, staying up to date on the latest material, making sure that you're still demonstrating that you are thinking critically and analytically, and you still have the ability to process. That a year of not demonstrating that ability might be enough to disincentivize selecting an individual. And if that is the case, what we might be able to do is we might assume maybe a political obligation. I don't know how this is sort of fanciful, or maybe even a business obligation, to make sure that those individuals who are unemployed, who are looking for a job, irrespective of whether we're cutting a check, forget that discussion. Let's make sure that we have something that they can do right? Let's make sure that there's a way that they can demonstrate that, you know, despite the fact that I haven't gotten a job in 6 months, I signed up for XYZ and completed some continuing education classes that are free and blah, 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 blah. It might not, I know this seems way out there, this is sort of pushing the boundary, but there has to be, the question is, why is it with respect to number 4, less money for education and the importance that has been placed on education, the relationship between education and economic ability, education and social mobilization, upward mobility. Why so important? Why so much emphasis on education? And, you know, my gut tells me that the inability to demonstrate that you have been using your education effectively for long periods of time disincentivizes an employer, because if you don't use it, you lose it. I mean, period. I used to be able to read pretty well ancient Greek, and I studied hard as hell. Trust me, I put in so many hours of trying to get it, and I wasn't exceptional, but I could do it. I could do it relatively well. And now, forget it. I've lost the skill because I don't use it. If there was a means for those who are unemployed, not just to get the check, but independent to that, to make sure that they're refining their skills and keeping up to date on their skills when they go for a job interview, it might then incentivize, right? You've shown me that despite the fact that you couldn't get a job for X number of months and you were on unemployment assistance for X number of months, I also see that you were doing all of these other things. I might want to select this person, right? So there has to be a means. It's not always just about cutting a check. There has to be a means to recognize that education is absolutely critical. It's inherent in upward mobility, and without a direct assessment of that relationship, I mean, comprehensive, multidisciplinary assessment of the relationship between education and social upward mobility, I think we're going to have more expensive poverty, not just in the city central, but also in the burbs, right? So I'll just put import of education for number 4. All right, and it's as important, if not more important, as it's ever been. All right, number 18, bottom of page 18, managing poor communities, and it's quote unquote managing. We talked I forget, a few hours ago, we talked about the relationship of this concept of nuisance, and how nuisance evolved from what was otherwise an attempt to protect the property value of a particular residence or the property value of a particular community from, you know, that sort of slobbish, dirty neighbor who won't keep his or her yard clean, to a transformation from just depreciation in property value to a transformation into the depreciation of moral value. Right? I don't want to live next to the blacks, because the blacks they're sort of, you know, they're an immoral group of folks, right? I don't want to live next to the Mexicans or the Hispanics, because, you know, the Hispanics, they don't have the right moral code that I have. So that this idea of nuisance and depreciation transformed itself from, really, it was more of a translation, but it translated from a depreciation and a devaluement of property to a depreciation, a devaluement as a consequence of the proximity of other ethnic groups and such. So the central city as a singularity is inherently associated with a plurality of suburbs, and that's what this is, right? The central city is associated with many burbs, right? It's connected by many suburban communities. Quote, central cities contain the concentration of the poor in the metropolitan area because of the lack of low-income housing outside the city. That's absolutely key. Right, because of the lack of low-income housing, right? So if there is a lack of low-income housing outside of the central city, again, another inverse relationship, if there's a lack of low-income housing outside of the central city, that necessitates an increase of the need for low-income housing inside the central city. So I'll say that again because it's not necessarily intuitively clear. Though it is true, if there's a decrease of the amount of maybe I can draw this or write this. Right? I'll draw it. So here's the central city, and here's the burb. Here's the burb that we're looking at. Suburb, central city. In the city, you recognize in the burbs there's a decrease of affordable housing. Right? There's a decrease. There aren't many affordable housing. There aren't many, what's the word that they use? Low income is probably better. Let's just be sort of vulgar. I think low income sounds really vulgar, but let's use that instead. Decrease in the amount of low income houses. Low. Right, there's a decreased amount of low income houses outside of the central city. Which means since there's a decrease of low income houses outside the central city, there needs to be an increase of low income houses inside the central city. And what do you think this does? What ends up happening is you end up having a boom. You end up having a multiplied, magnified need for increased low-income housing within the city central, because that's the only place to go. And thus what ends up happening? Precisely that. So now what ends up happening is, as a consequence of not having low-income housing outside, it duplicates, it doubles the need. It magnifies the need for this type of housing in the city central. And thus, those houses are built. And thus, you have a clearer demarcation in terms of socioeconomic strata between the city and the burbs. But more importantly, what you end up having is a cultural and a racial demarcation, so that poor minorities become concentrated in the city, and middle class or affluent, primarily white communities, become aggregated within the suburbs. The point of the matter is this aggregation of groups, both racially and socioeconomically, is itself a consequence of the lack of low-income housing in the burbs. The ability to include the lack of low-income housing in the burbs transforms the nature of the burbs, and thus transforms this, what would seem to be inherently dichotomous relationship. It's completely arbitrary. Now, there are consequences of making low-income housing available in the burbs, and communities particularly protest against this, just like they would having a trash, believe it or not, but this is true, just like they would protest having a trash dump in their backyard, waste management facility in their backyard. And this is the concept of NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. I talked about that several hours ago. What we need to do is recognize the advantages that are gained by selectively targeting aspects of various communities in the burbs for an inclusion of low-income housing as a consequence of the arts, the ability for social upward mobility for those who are underrepresented in the burbs. Right? So there is a social obligation to do this, but it is tremendously easier said than done. Because the first thing that the residents and their tax dollars hear is, wow, they're gonna bust in a ton of poor people to live, 3 blocks from my house. I don't know if I want that. That's the gut vibe. No one's gonna say that because everybody's PC, but quietly, in the privacy of their own homes, much of the property owners, and I don't just mean whites, right? This isn't a black-white thing. But those who are, well, I guess it is a black-white thing, but I'm not going to present it as a black-white thing. I want to present it as a socioeconomic thing. The property owners are thinking exactly the same thing as we said before. A potential depreciation of property value by an increase of rental communities near the house. A depreciation of property value by a potential increase in criminality and crime, which might not be founded in terms of scientifically, statistically founded. And thus, people might want to sell their houses and go live further and further in more isolated communities, and thus a spreading of potential poverty as one consequence. There must be a recognition that we can cohabitate as American citizens. Right? I'm doing this lecture for I mean, I know it's a global lecture, but I'm contextualizing it within the United States of America. But as American citizens, we have to recognize that we're only as strong as our weakest link. It's a bit hokey, it's a bit corny, but it's true, right? If we don't have various degrees of social services and inclusive measures, it doesn't always have to be cutting a check. I agree with the conservatives on this point, 100%, right? Can't always be that we're just cutting checks, because I definitely believe you don't bolster an independence. You need, but then again, times are hard. Times are hard. Sometimes people need that support. But it's easier said than done. In terms of the attempt to make a change, conceptualizing for those already established communities. We're not talking about the next generation of metropolitan communities, but existing infrastructural relations between the central city and the burbs. It's important to recognize that the inability or the decreased ability to find low-income housing outside of the central city incentivizes and magnifies a need for increased low-income housing in the central city. Okay, so number two. So that was number one. Number two, it's important to note that the term contain and outside in the preceding citation both reference poor communities. That is, the management of potential conflict is situated around the management of poor communities. So we have to be very careful how we talk, just from a very subtle conceptual standpoint, because you don't want to begin the slippery slope of dehumanization and the slippery slope of dehumanizing poverty and those who are poor. Well, you can't dehumanize poverty, but you can dehumanize the poor. In terms of this potential dehumanization, right, the containment, right, we have to contain poverty. We have to prevent it from, of course we recognize we have to contain poverty. Of course we recognize we have to manage poverty. But poverty manifests itself as affective, with an A, in the lives of people, poor people. In terms of its manifestation in the lives of poor people, we don't want to use the same language for the concept poverty and all the statistical facts associated with the concept and apply that managerial language to the people. It's important that we demarcate the concept from its application and its affect, its influence on the people's lives. With respect to the people, we're talking about human beings. We're talking about American citizens. So the management of poverty is one thing, but the management of poor people can be very problematic, right? This is how you immediately think of the ghetto, right? You think of, it doesn't have to go to Nazi Germany, but you think about the consolidation of poor people as a consequence of, disproportionate representation in zoning laws. You think about gerrymandering and the ability to contain poor people and the influence of their vote in a community that might vote otherwise, so that you break districts so that it accommodates, partisan politics and all of this other stuff. Does this happen? Every day. It happens all the time. Will it continue to happen? It will absolutely continue to happen. I talked about next generation sort of gerrymandering practices that might unfold, hours ago, maybe in the first or second segment of this, which is a bit out there. It's a little bit more sort of social science fiction in a sense. But the idea is a recognition that in terms of this containment, in terms of this management, it's the containment of the concept. It is the containment of the negative statistical effects of poverty, not the containment of people, right? Not the containment of people, because the people aren't contagious, right? It's not something that you can catch, per se. Okay. Next page, page 19, number 3. Heavy reliance on the property tax leads central cities and suburbs to compete. And that's sort of obvious. I mean, in terms of competition, I don't want to go too much into the competition, but, the greatest competition is competition for very, very, very increasingly selective educational opportunity, which is the biggest competition, to be honest with you. For those, birthed to about 18 years old, that's the competition. Competition after 18 is probably economic competition. It's the regular game, but before 18, it's educational opportunity. The greatest educational opportunities, then, the argument goes, this isn't my argument, has been strategic. This is more, Jonathan Kozol talks about this, has been strategically reserved for those members of the community, doesn't necessarily have to be black or white, who have the property values which are significant enough to allow them access to the best schools, public schools, because property taxes pay for our public education and such. Thus, if you live in the cities, you could have the unfortunate circumstance. I was watching this like 2 days ago in New Jersey. There's a New Jersey high school like right down from the governor's mansion, and they showed the school, and I was like, is this America? Is this the United States? This is 2014. Like, I mean, the teachers were walking around with like face masks because they didn't want to get, I don't know if it was asbestos, but they didn't want to get contamination from mold. There were holes in the wall, and I mean, you think about the consequence, not just in terms of health, which is obvious, right? I mean, you're exposing children and teachers to potentially toxic, biologically toxic environments for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That in itself should galvanize people that something needs to happen to the school. But just psychologically, right? Psychologically, the idea is, well, I go to that school. Like, I go to that dirty school. I go to that dilapidated school. I go to the school that makes you sick. And it disincentivizes association with school. School is not the place to go where all the world becomes open to you. That access is open to you. That opportunity is open to you, because school is a place that you meet your friends and you have fun and you have the great teachers and you have all the latest technology and you feel motivated and incentivized. I'm an educator. I've been educating for a while now, and compared to some of the really established educators, not that long. But for me, it's about to be 5 years this year that I've been teaching at the PhD level, and I'm here to tell you, as someone who's been doing it for years, 60% of what I do is encouragement. 40% of it is the actual education. 60% overwhelmingly of what I do for my students is to encourage them, right? If you come to me and you're like, hey, Dr. Campbell, I have this great idea, oh my goodness, and I'm like, well, I think somebody already wrote that, I don't think that's a good, yeah, it's okay. Then you're going to be like, well, maybe it's not that good an idea. If you go to school and the outside of your school is dilapidated and there's holes and there's water dripping from the ceilings and your teachers are getting sick and they're missing days because there's mold in the walls and, you don't have any technology, you're just going to be like, school? I mean, why would I want to go to school? That place sucks. Like, I don't want to go to school. There's nothing there for me. And that's a shame. That's a shame. That's a failure on our part as citizens. That's a failure on the part of our representatives to allow that state of affairs to occur for those students. And, it's important, right? It's very important. So in terms of competition, for me, again, the greatest competition is the competition for educational resources, because it's directly related to, and it doesn't necessarily have to be formal education, right? But I'm not going to get into that. It's directly related to the prospects of upward mobility. So number 4, this is top of page 19. Let's see how long this section is. Page 19. Economic redistribution. So the role, I'm just going to read a lot of this. The role of property taxes defines much of the ensuing conflict, as I just said. So this is a key point. Inequalities in resource allocation across districts are related to the tradition of funding public schools through local property taxes. Direct quote, and I just explained it, right? So I just showed you how the community and this is just an example, right? Because I just heard it in the news, and I always incorporate contemporary stuff in my lectures. But this particular school in Jersey, right down the street from the governor's mansion, is in such a state of disrepair because you better believe that the surrounding community is an impoverished community. And there hasn't been enough generation of local taxpaying dollars to help the students of that school. There needs to be a reappropriation of funds of tax funds, not federal tax funds, but state tax funds. There needs to be a reappropriation of funds in order to help that school district, because, as I said before, we need to do it for their health, more importantly than anything, but we also need to do it for morale. Morale is something that's real. Morale is something that exists in the world. It's hard to quantify. But you talk to anybody who's in a leadership position, you talk to any educator, you talk to anybody who assumes leadership, my responsibility more than anything than just communicating the information as a leader is to make sure that my students maintain a high level of morale, that they see in me the excitement to teach. Dr. Campbell's throwing up another 100 hours of lecture. This guy doesn't stop. He just put out 2 books. He's working on IGAR. He's doing this. He just came back from here. He did that. I can't complain because I just got to write a 12-page paper. Let me get my game. But if I was over here like, oh no, their morale would be low. We have a responsibility to make sure that the property taxes are used for educational accessibility because it incentivizes a high morale for the students and the nation gets stronger, right? Because out of those students, you might get, out of 1,000 students, if you get 25, 30 students who go STEM heavy, who end up making huge inventions as a consequence of that boost in morale, it was worth it. It was worth whatever tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that we invested, because we need that. We need technology. We need advancement. We need STEM and otherwise, and also social science students to propel this next generation of American productivity, right? And the only place we're going to get them from is the school system. Duh. All right. So here's a problem: the super concentration of middle-income housing in the suburbs means a greater potential for tax revenue generated from the suburbs than the central city. I explained that. Potential solution: the quote, unquote, this is a quote from the text, the metropolitan-wide sharing of the burden of social and tax problems. It becomes the responsibility of, for example, in this example of New Jersey, the taxpayers in New Jersey to recognize that we have an obligation not to allow that school district to fall into that state of disrepair. Because it's not so much that we're competing, right? We are all American citizens. This is our nation. And in terms of the next generation of economic advancement, in terms of our military might, in terms of our educational prowess, in terms of our health, in terms of everything that you can possibly think of, none of these things that I just described are going to be able to sustain themselves without an educated workforce, without an educated community always filling those who have completed their tenure, right? So as the old school retire and they move on with their life and they completed their service in whatever respect, there's a growing need, and that growing need is going to be not just for warm bodies, but for warm bodies who know how to think critically, for warm bodies who know how to make assessments or program code or, mix certain chemicals and blah, 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 blah. So it's important to recognize that, yeah, redistribution, I don't want to say this, I think people who have been watching me long enough know that I'm not partisan, and this isn't a political lecture. So I recognize that there might be some aversion to quote-unquote redistribution of wealth. But I think if we separate ourselves from the term redistribution and recognize that what we're really talking about is alternative appropriations of funds, that we're taking funds and we're appropriating funds so that our students aren't in, mold-infested high schools. It's just the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do, and we ought to be doing that. All right, C1, so a potential benefit, equality and resource allocation, which is what I was just talking about, right? It's amazing. The consistency. I love it. Logic. You gotta love logic. So it's about allocation, as I just said. Number 2, explain the transition from equality to opportunity accessibility. So the idea is there was in maybe the last generation, maybe like late 70s, early 80s-ish, there was discourse among theorists that in terms of justice really pertained to equality, so that you could reduce all of justice to equality. And this failed rather miserably, this idea. It was needed, the failure was needed, but one of the main problems, without getting off tangent and not going all the way back to antiquity, but one of the main problems with the attempt to reduce justice to equality, because the justice beams, right? You see the justice beams and it has to be equal, right? If it's lopsided, there's some inequality. And the visual cue for justice has always been the balance beam, right? So it's like equality. The problem with equality is, and this is where I think more conservative circles have it right. It's not my responsibility to ensure that other people's have, if they don't have, perpetually. There has to be social systems in place to help people, but I can't be charged with the responsibility of footing the bill for everybody. Okay, fair. I'll grant that. In terms of equality, though, it's deeper than that, right? The inherent problem with equality is a consequence of, and I don't want to go too deep, is a consequence of the system that we have in place. Our governing system is one of capital, and as a consequence of that, it's inherent, right? And this is true. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but poverty is inherent in the system of capital. It is inherent. Our goal is to make sure that it's the smallest number possible, because that's the best thing possible. There isn't, I don't believe in, and I'm not going to apologize for my bias in this point, so you might not agree with me on this point, but I don't believe in a wholly egalitarian global economic system. I think it's ludicrous, and I'm ignorant now. Maybe 50 years from now, 30 years, if only 50 more years, 30 more years from now, someone will come up with some great theory and I'll probably change my mind. But I'm going on the record as saying that's ridiculous. I just don't understand how that could ever work. I've never read a theorist that made any sense of that possibility. The reigning economic system that we have is capital. Within capital, there is an inherency of poverty. The idea is, since there is an inherency of poverty, it would need its own justification. I'm not going to get into that now, but there is, just take my word from it. There's an inherency of poverty. Equality is impossible under this system. It's not possible. Our responsibility then is not to throw up our arms and say, well, it's impossible, so screw it. There's going to be a ton of poor people. Let's get the most poor people possible. No. The idea is it's impossible to eradicate poverty, but what we can do is mitigate or minimize poverty. So we want that number to be the lowest possible number, and that's the goal. So we move from equality then to opportunity. The way in which we decrease the overrepresentation of poverty in our minority communities, the way in which we decrease the overrepresentation of poverty in our impoverished central cities, and growingly in our suburbs, is by creating systems that maximize educational and resource opportunity. So we've moved from equality, because it's ridiculous on a capitalistic model, and we've gone to opportunity. Now, real quick, and then I'll move on. I don't want to spend too much time on this. For you, you young up-and-comers, you next generation of educators, and what's cool about this is I'm uploading this video now, and I'm thinking about people who are watching this video in 2014, but I'm also comforted by the fact that you might be watching this video in 2025 or 2035, if it's still around. And that to me just makes me happy. Right? It really does. It brings me a tremendous happiness that, 40 years from now, 30 years from now, you, whoever you are, might be watching this and be like, hey, Dr. Campbell is probably right. Yeah, let's think about opportunity. Think about opportunity, right? We need to think about ways in which we can operationalize opportunity as the means with which we decrease the representation of poverty in our capitalistic system. I think that's the best thing that we can do. I actually believe it's a moral obligation that we have, but I'm going to stop there. And then number 3, this is 4C3, the potential problem, the politicization of quote-unquote sharing in terms of socialism, right? So you'll have your regular sort of talk radio folk who will get on and say, oh, this is socialism because we're reappropriating wealth. Oh, they're taking from those who've worked hard and diligently and they're giving to those lazy people. I mean, that's, it doesn't really warrant me, it really doesn't warrant me addressing it with any type of edification. It's ridiculous because it's an oversimplification. The idea is we're all in this together. There has to be social structures in place to minimize the overrepresentation of poverty in certain localities, in certain ethnical groupings and race and such. But there isn't a problem. There isn't a problem with sharing, right? Sharing isn't a bad thing. Capitalism and those who make it to the top will tell you that their rise upward, their increase in wealth as a consequence of their business relationships and the fact that they did share. So there are benefits, right? But I'm not going to get into this because it's not about preaching, it's about teaching. All right, number 5, infrastructural redistribution. So instead of the reappropriation of tax dollars from the suburbs into the central city, which is, whether justly or not, generally interpreted as, quote-unquote, the redistribution of wealth, a better option might be, this is all me writing, a better option might be a redistribution of middle-class or middle-income residential housing within central cities, right, as an infrastructural redistribution rather than economic redistribution. So, okay, for those who have what I think is a rather just argument that you can't just foot the bill and expect to cut a check and solve the problem of poverty, they're absolutely right. There's no denying that. You can't just perpetually cut checks and think that you're solving a problem. You're patchworking a problem at best, and those patchworks, you know, they're going to be sieves of an enormous explosion of poverty if it's just, here's a check. What can be done, 2 things immediately, is 1, we can redistribute infrastructurally in a spotted, very calculated, systematic method. We can redistribute infrastructurally low-income houses in the suburbs. That's 1. And 2, we can redistribute infrastructurally middle-income houses in the city central, so that you have a translocation, if you will, of members from poorer communities in the central city out into the burbs, and you have potential residents who would otherwise gravitate towards the burbs, now gravitating towards the city central, and thus you have a nice heterogeneous mixing, rather than this, what is obviously homogenized distribution and consolidation of sort of income brackets. Lower income bracket here, middle to upper here, right? You can have a more heterogeneous association socioeconomically. 5A, bottom of page 19, potential problem. Cities are largely sedentary infrastructural networks which aren't amenable to physical change. Cities were created in a time where the physical transportation to work was the only means of earning a wage, top of page 20. Now, however, many are earning their wages without the same emphasis on transportation and proximity, which may warrant a physical redesign. Right? So, you know, when I hear myself read it, I'm like, man, you know, I want to write about this too. I want to write about everything. It sounds good, but it's true. The idea is, of course, we're not talking about bulldozing huge buildings and, you know, bulldozing whole shopping malls to reconfigure. I mean, it's just not practical. It's not practical. We have to work with the existing infrastructure that we have. The idea isn't to transform the infrastructure per se. Now, I get it in terms of gentrification. There might be a need to do that localized in specific inner city communities as a means of enticement. I get it. And a means of attracting potential tax revenue for the inner city. I get that. That's fine. But, you know, on a macro level, we can't do that. It would be exorbitant funds needed. It would bankrupt any of the developers because it's not sustainable. What can we do? Based on the existing infrastructure in place, let's not talk about transforming the infrastructure, but transforming the enticement. This is all PR. This is all marketing, right? Transform the enticement to the infrastructure by recognizing we have excluded, on both accounts, members from participation with the building. Hey, come to our building. Come live in our community. You know, relocate yourself from here to here. Why don't you come here? Blah, blah, blah. So that the infrastructure is in place. No one's talking about cutting huge checks to redesign infrastructure as much as it is we transform the way in which we see the inner city. We also transform the way in which we see the suburbs. Why? Because these things are amenable to social construction. Not the buildings themselves. Those aren't, obviously. Well, I guess, technically speaking, I guess they are amenable to social construction. You can literally construct it. But it's more resistant, right? But what we can do is transform the mechanisms that we use to entice people to these communities. Why? Because it was a consequence of our desire, nothing more than our desire, to isolate our residents from our workplace that served as the really theoretical basis for the establishment of something that's actually real now, which is suburban communities. All right, number 3, see that link and the reference to zones. So in terms of zoning, we recognize some of the unfortunate problems and consequences that result through zoning. I talked about zoning and problems in zoning before. Number 6, mobility programs. Research finding indicates that a productive strategy for ensuring a better quality of life for the inner city poor, often mired in concentrations of poverty, is to substantially expand the use of housing choices, or quote-unquote mobility programs, further facilitating larger numbers of disadvantaged to residents in the more desirable sections of the metropolitan area. Anthony Downs argued that policymakers need to ensure suburban housing opportunities for minorities. The minority bit, yeah, okay, sure, I get it. It's really, to be technical, it's housing opportunities for low-income members of our society, for the poor. And that's what it is. It's indirectly associated with the minority community. It's directly associated with one's socioeconomic status, and that socioeconomic status transcends just blacks or Hispanics, right? It can be anybody. All right, so again, so that repeated the point. And then lastly, number 7 for section 1.7, policy and federal subsidies. Agricultural policy helped drive the marginal worker off the farm into the city. The federal housing policy promoted the buildup of suburban tracts, and the federal highway program bulldozed vast areas of the central city, but also made it easier for the suburbanite to live a greater distance from his job in the city and facilitated movement of industry form. So that idea of sprawl became systemically entrenched in our construction, in our engineering, right? And the way in which we built our cities, both our buildings architecturally and the foundations and the networks and plumbing and everything. All of that is already in place. It was a consequence of an old model, an old national interpretation. And the argument is we can change this if we want to. How it changes is only a consequence of our desire to transform both our suburban communities and our central cities such that they aren't dualistically antithetical, homogenized groupings for, I'm not going to say blacks and whites, but homogenized groupings for those who are in a particular socioeconomic bracket and those who do not have access yet to that opportunity. It's not about equality as much as it is about creating the condition for the opportunity to access the latter. Two ways in which we can create a condition for the opportunity, and then people will fail and some will and some won't. That's part of capital. Those who don't will continue to be poor. Those who do will rise out of their poverty. 2 ways in which we can do this. We begin a concentrated effort to have representation within suburban communities of low-income housing. Why will that benefit? Because those who do not have the educational resource opportunities that they would in the city center now have educational opportunity and educational accessibility to the good schools, which means that our schools become more diversified, which means that upward mobility for these students are better. Via gentrification and some outside private investment, we could conceptually entice middle-class families to not live in the suburban community, but to live in the city central. And all of the economic advantages, I talked about this before, hours ago, that could arise. Thus, we have dual, simultaneously, possibly, and this is practical as hell, like this can be done. This is not that complicated. The only drawback is that you're looking at about a 15-20 year return on your investment. It's going to take time for those students to graduate from high school, get into good colleges, and find jobs. But I believe that that investment, and just the way in which we interpret how we use our, how we think about and we use the infrastructure existing in the suburban communities and in the city center, can reap huge advantages for our metropolitan areas and our national community. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.